it's Mistress Carrie reporting for duty from MCHQ for episode 135 of the Mistress Carrie podcast. And before we get to this week's guest, author and podcast host, Martin Popoff, I wanted to just say a quick Happy New Year and thank you. The Mistress Carrie podcast grew so much in 2022, and we couldn't have done it without you. Thank you so much for liking the episodes and commenting and sharing. Thank you for all of the 5-star reviews and for all of the amazing comments on social media. And a huge thank you to all of my guests who took time out of their busy and successful careers to sit down and answer my sometimes ridiculous questions. 2022 was a year of growth, and we've got so many plans for 2023. And to kick it off, my first guest of the year, author and podcast host Martin Popoff, knows a thing or two about music. Martin has written over 115 books on hard rock, heavy metal, prog rock, punk, and record collecting. He's also worked with Banger Films, and he's the host of History in 5 Songs, the podcast, that you can find with the Mistress Carrie podcast as part of the Pantheon podcast network. Martin and I sat down to talk about his new book, Pink Floyd and the Dark Side of the Moon, 50 Years. But we also ended up talking about his upbringing, his writing process, his musical background, and our ideas and opinions on what makes a great song, what makes a great artist, and what makes a legendary album. Martin is such a knowledgeable guy when it comes to all things rock. And if you're a Pink Floyd lover and you want to take a deep dive into Dark Side of the Moon, his new book is a must-get. It'll be available on Valentine's Day, and you can pre-order it right now. So, allow me to introduce you to the one and only Martin Popoff.
Hey, what's up? This is Sully from Godsmack. Strap on those boots, baby, because you are now in the trenches of the war room with the one and only Mistress Carrie right here on the Mistress Carrie podcast.
What's up? This is Joe Rogan, and you're listening to Mistress Carrie.
Her hair so lovely, pretty eyes.
Hey, this is Brent from Shinedown, and you're listening to Mistress Carrie. Hey, Carrie, go put your bra on, girl.
Hey, this is Steven Tyler, and you be listening to the baddest bitch in Boston, Mistress Carrie.
What's up? This is Aaron from Stain, and you're listening to Mistress Carrie.
Hi, everybody. This is Dave Grohl from the Foo Fighters, and you're listening to the one, the only Mistress Carrie.
Hey, this is David from the band Disturbed, and you're listening to the baddest bitch in Boston, Mistress Carrie.
Hi, Bruce Dickinson here from Iron Maiden. Yes, indeed, Miss Whiplash herself, Mrs. Carrie, is here to unchain your brain.
Hi, this is Flea from the Red Hot Chili Peppers. You're listening to Mistress Carrie.
This is Dennis Leary. You are listening to my favorite, Mistress Carrie.
Hey, this is Corey from Stone Sour, and you're listening to, you have the privilege of listening to Mistress Carrie. Oh, God. Oh, yeah.
Well, hello, Mr. Popoff.
Yes. Hi, Mistress Carrie. How are you doing today?
Fellow Pantheon Podcast Network member.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It's nice to see you. Happy New Year.
Yes, you too.
You're my first episode of the new year, so I'm starting the new year off on a massive foot. So thank you for doing this.
Yeah, well, good company. You've interviewed a lot of pretty heavy hitters. So
I have, as have you. I've done a lot of interviews over my radio and podcasting career, but when I started doing a deep dive into your career, do you know exactly how many books you've written?
Well, I've been saying 115 for a few months now, so it's at least that, if not a few more now.
So you don't literally have an answer for how many books you have written?
Well, it's kind of vague, right? Some don't need a lot of writing. Some are updates of older books. Some are, I took an old book and split it into 2. So there's no way of knowing the right number. So
it's unbelievable. Obviously I know you most recently because of your podcast, because we're in the same podcast network. But when I started looking into your career, people have told me for years that I need to write a book about my career, about my life story. And the idea of starting a book seems like the most arduous of tasks. And everyone that I've interviewed, most recently Geezer Butler, from Black Sabbath. And I always say, like, how do you get past the first blank page? You've done that over 115 times.
Yep. Well, there's a very, very easy way to do it. Lay out a bunch of chapters, put everything kind of in order and get that framework done. Put it in like 24-point type and then just start filling in the gaps. That's one way to do it. When you're writing, say, a biography of a band or whatever, like if you got interviews and you got quotes, and then you just start grabbing stuff and throwing it in place, and that way you can kind of build the thing up. And it's that whole concept of like, break it into bite-sized chunks.
Yeah. Eat the elephant one bite at a time, as they say.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, can we talk about, before we get to your new book, can we talk a little bit about your backstory? You're Canadian, obviously. And so, hello up there. How is your winter going? You guys all right so far?
Pretty good. Yeah, my parents out west are really getting hit with it. It's minus 18 Celsius right now with a couple of feet of snow. So no, we haven't had much at all. So it's.
Can you do that conversion for the stupid American over here? Do you know what that is in Fahrenheit?
If 32 is 0 in Fahrenheit, so it's probably in the region of minus 10 or minus 20.
That's completely unnecessary.
Yeah.
So, you grew up in Canada. Was music always around in the house growing up?
Yeah, so I mean, it was Trail, BC. So it was a small town in the west, directly 2 hours north of Spokane, Washington. So that's where we'd go buy our records, or Vancouver. Vancouver was 8 hours away. But no, not particularly from the parents, but an older brother of a buddy and some older cousins. But I mean, I was heavy into it by 9-10 years old. So, that would have been 1971, 72. And then by 73, 74, me and a couple buddies were crazy experts, right? Had the circus subscription and buying Cream and Hit Parader. And just, by 1976 and the Kiss Army and all that, well on the way at that point. And then the new wave of British heavy metal hits, and there's suddenly all sorts of great heavy music. We were just absolutely mathematically, it had to be heavy, right, as kids. But at that point, you're getting imports and you're getting Sounds Magazine and Kerrang, and then MTV starts up and yeah, and never really did anything business wise or to be part of it other than just being a crazy fan up until about 1993. And at that point, so I'm 30 at that point, and wrote my first book. It was a book of record reviews called Riff Kills Man, 25 Years of Recorded Hard Rock and Heavy Metal, self-published, 1,942 heavy metal record reviews. That thing got reissued through a publisher and expanded, and then that eventually got broken into, 4 different decades. But a big time is 1994. So moved to Toronto, got involved with Tim Henderson, who was starting his heavy metal magazine, Brave Words and Bloody Knuckles. And that's when, the floodgates opened, started interviewing bands constantly and getting all those free CDs and writing reviews and liner notes and bios and all that. So 94 to 2000 was doing that part-time while doing my other job. And then 2000, I went full-time.
So when you were growing up and you're just loving music and you just have this appetite for the magazines, the albums, the imports, all of that kind of stuff, are you a musician? Can you play instruments at all? Are you musically inclined? Because I can talk music, but I have no musical ability whatsoever.
Yeah. Well, as far as I went was in a bar band for one summer. I was a drummer. So I took a lot of drum lessons, and I was a drummer and had drums all the time. And so, yeah, we had one bar band once. We were called Torque, but that's it. And then jammed with buddies and had garage situations and stuff, but always had a bass, guitar, keyboards around, could plunk away at all that stuff as well. But yeah, I'm kind of a drummer, a hack drummer.
So what did you go to school for? What was your major in college?
I did a BA in English, and then I did an MBA. So that would have been 81 to like 85, 86, 87. Got out of that, worked for Xerox, quit Xerox after 3 years. Was a sort of self-employed entrepreneur with a buddy, and we had one employee, and we were a print broker, desktop publishing company. So basically running around all the office towers of Toronto trying to sell printing jobs to people. It's funny. I look at every single job I've had, and they're all obsolete, right? So I sold typewriters. fax machines, photocopiers. I worked in a record store. I sold TVs. I sold car stereos. They're obsolete. You don't buy car stereos, from a stereo store anymore. I wrote for magazines. I write about heavy metal. So and now I do books, which have been around for hundreds of years. So it's funny. It's like literally every job I've had has been, they've been telling us that it won't exist one day.
Well, luckily the record stores are having a resurgence because of this newfound love of vinyl again, which I'm so excited about.
Yeah, there is that. And then maybe even CDs will come back at some point. But physical, I mean, I'm having a lot of people telling me now who love buying CDs and love buying physical that they're really now starting to get, there's this new challenge in the last 12 months of even being able to find the CDs of bands you want to buy. So it could actually happen where they even really absolutely stop even on the CDs, right? But yeah, the vinyl, you've got the reissue vinyl, but it's really funny how the old vinyl, I mean, most of that, which, 90% of the bands on old vinyl go for like under $7 or $8, but reissue vinyl is like $35-$40. And then the original vinyl by only the bands that have been allowed to live, which is probably under 50 bands, are expensive, right? So it's still the fact that there are hundreds of thousands of records floating around out there that nobody wants, right?
Yeah. And now, newer bands are printing a certain amount of limited picture discs, colored vinyl, all of that stuff. But they're also making cassettes again, which I talked to a lot of bands about. And I'm like,
yeah,
really? It's like a collectible thing. And I've said this, anybody that listens to the podcast a lot, I've said this, no band has taken me up on it, that if they're going to sell cassettes, they need to sell a logoed pencil with the cassette. Yeah. And only people that grew up listening to cassettes know why.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And nobody's done it yet.
It's got to be the right width too, right? Just to get in there perfectly size. And start turning it. Yeah.
That's right. So when you sit down and you go, okay, I want to write a book, do you make the decision to write a book and then choose the topic? Or does the topic choose you? How does that work? Because you've done it over 115 times.
Yeah, well, I mean, generally, the main normal reason to write a book is because I love the band and I have now interviewed the band 15, 20, 25 times, right? So once I have a whole pile of my own interview stuff, I think, okay, now I have a reason to put it out there. I have fresh material that's my own to put in that. But quite often, there's been a lot of books lately and a lot of concepts, like with Quarto books, Voyager, Motor books, the name kind of keeps changing. But some of those concepts that I've done books for then have come from them, and including this new Pink Floyd book, which is a concept of theirs. So there are a bunch of bands, thanks to Quarto, there are a bunch of bands that I've been able to write books on that I never would have written a book on. David Bowie, Queen, Pink Floyd, AC/DC, even I haven't done a lot of interviews with. So, but then there's all those, all the heavy metal, dad rock, classic rock bands that I've written tons of books on that are because I have had a lot of interviews. But it's kind of cool that there have been these other concepts that have come up that have allowed me to write books on bands that I've never interviewed before.
I mean, obviously, if you're going to write a book on Queen, if you're going to write a book on AC/DC, and you don't have a lot of your own original interview content to work from, there's almost unlimited Googling, right? That there's all of this source material. But if you're going to write a book about those bands, you've got to be able to vet it all, right? So what is that process for you if you're not going back to your own interviews? How does that work?
Well, let me say this as well. When I said I could write books on all those bands, I would refuse to write a book on any of those bands if they were if someone said, we want you to make it like a normal book with a lot of quotes, because I won't write a book where 70, 60, 50% of the quotes are not mine. So these concepts that I've talked about that I've been able to do that are absolutely no quote books. That's why they've been easy to do. But yes, you still have to, but now there are other things, right? Like the David Bowie is called Bowie at 75. And the concept from Dennis, my publisher over there, who's awesome, and he knows music, and they do all the images and stuff. But that was their concept. And they've done I don't know how many, 4 or 5 of these. And I've done some other ones as well that aren't out yet. But the idea there was simply go away and come up with 75 David Bowie career highlights or milestones and write about them. Here's your word count, do the math. I think it worked out to 600-700 words each. So yeah, I've got to go read a bunch of Bowie books, and I've got to look on the net and do all that endless Googling and compare things. And then when stories don't match, I have to kind of make a judgment call, which one I believe, and all that stuff, and find stats. So yeah, there's a lot of research that way. But yeah, it's really cool to be, I've been doing these ones. First, I did a bunch for them, and now I'm doing some for my UK publisher, where I'm simply going and interviewing a bunch of experts of bands and doing a Q&A on every studio album. So it's like, again, it's not my stuff. I'm like the moderator of this book. So, there's part of your answer. Those ones I include in books that I've written, but I'm not the main speaker in those. I'm like just basically, herding all these cats and putting it all in order and writing intros and things like that. So yeah, there's a ton of different ways to do these things.
It blows my mind that someone, let's use David Bowie as an example. He's not even with us anymore. That you could be so famous and have such a career and a legacy and a body of work that total strangers that you've never even met are writing books about you.
That's how it works.
You're not involved in the process. It's just
yeah, that's true. I mean, it's that's almost a different question. Like it is weird to have. Yeah, a total stranger write books on you, right?
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Yeah.
He's not with us anymore, but he's had many, many books written on him while he was alive as well. Yeah, it is very bizarre, right?
Have you gotten feedback from the artist that you've written about that's been good and or bad? Has your phone ever rung randomly and been like,
usually none at all. And the funny thing is, it always amuses me to no end, but maybe this is a guy thing, right? Because guys don't really communicate with each other, right? But I would get many times in interviews with guys, who I've written books on, and I won't bring it up that I wrote a book on them. And they know that I wrote a book on them usually. And they might make one quick comment and then we'd both be kind of uncomfortable and move on and finish the interview. It's like they don't want to talk about me having written a book on them, and I certainly don't want to bring it up to them either, because I keep thinking there's nothing good coming from this. I mean, it could only be bad, right? They can only complain that you wrote a book on them or something, right?
Well, there's definitely a difference between, say, the aforementioned Geezer Butler that I spoke on, who talked about the difficulty of kind of writing his life story. So there's a difference between being someone's biographer and writing a factual-based book on someone's life. Yeah. And then writing a book that's based on your expert opinion on what you think their best body of work is, on what you think the most influential moments of their life, what you think their impact on music is. That's all opinion. So at that point, it all rests on your shoulders as to whether or not someone agrees with you or not.
Right. But the biggest difference between an autobiography and a biography is the autobiography isn't going out and talking to the whole rest of the band and the producers, the album cover artists and all that kind of stuff. Right. So there's a very big use of having a biography. It's 20, 30, 40 different people talking about that band. When it's autobiography, it's just you talking. The odd autobiography guy, gets all bright and bushy-tailed and actually goes out and even interviews some other people to get their advice, and then they have to kind of figure out, how do I stick this in my book, right? And they'll make little pull quotes or whatever. But yeah, and then the other thing that I do with these books, I suppose, and this I sort of was inspired by 3 of my favorite books that I've ever had to do are The Clash, all the albums, all the songs, Led Zeppelin, all the albums, all the songs, and Lively Arts, The Damned Deconstructed. All of those were literally me writing reviews of every single song by those 3 bands. And I loved doing that. So that process has inspired me to say, okay, when I write just a normal biography on a band, I'm going to really be even more dissecting of the songs. I'm going to put in my opinion, breaking down the songs, putting the context of the times in. But, normally what I like to do is I really want there to be lots and lots and lots of quotes, preferably, gathered by me, specifically.
So when you're working on a book about a specific artist, can you give me a few examples of things you discovered about an artist in your research that completely surprised you? Something that you learned along the way, because you are so knowledgeable on music that even you can be surprised by some things you uncover. And you've written about a lot of amazing artists.
Yeah. Wow. You know what? It's funny getting asked that, because you get asked that about a specific book quite often, but when someone asks you about your whole thing, like my mind just goes like scrambled eggs, right? I can't even, I just think of all the great interviews I've had with a lot of these guys. Like some people are amazing interviews and some people are not so great interviews. Yeah. They're either cranky or just not very introspective, or they stumble over their words.
Or they just don't even talk a lot. Like, it's hard to explain to someone that doesn't interview people for a living, but when you're talking to someone and you're only getting 1 or 2 word answers, I'm sure people did it around the holiday table with their families, that there's the person that never shuts up, and then there's the person that just goes, yep. And when you're trying to interview someone and all they give you is yep and nope, there's a lot of dance. It's like dancing with a corpse.
Yeah. Oh, a funny thing is the idea of, have you ever been asked to do email interviews with people, right?
No.
Well, I have lots of times, because usually what we're doing is putting stuff into print, right? So quite often you get asked that, and there's always this conversation and negotiation that goes back and forth. I say, look, I'm telling you, they're going to give me nothing. I mean, nobody who likes doing them, no one really does a good job of them, and every single time it's the same thing. So you want to get a bunch of yeps and nos. Try get an email interview out of a rock star.
People have asked me to do them when they've interviewed me, but because my entire career has been in audio, whether it be radio or podcasting, or even some of the video and television work that I've done, kind of hard to do that by email, right? Because I need the actual audio to function. Yeah. But the times that people have asked me for email interviews, I roll my eyes and just sit back, and I'm like, can we just talk? Can you just record me and then you can type it out? But I don't want to sit there and type out my answers. Like, I'm not a writer.
Yeah, it's a laziness on the other end for sure, because the transcribing process is the really painful thing, right? But one thing, when people ask me, and I get asked that all the time, and I usually comply, but what I do now is I turn on my voice recognition software and just record the whole thing straight in, and it's like speak it all in and then just clean it up. So people are really surprised when I give them back usually a pretty darn substantial email interview, and it's because I talked it in. There was no way I was going to type all that, right?
Well, technology has gone far since your typewriter sales days.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, and then the other thing that happens is sometimes when I'm asked to do them, and they're going to translate it into a foreign language at the other end, I just say, look, I'm just going to give this back to you like a mess. I'm not going to edit it properly for English, because I know you're going to translate it anyways, but I'll also send you the audio file, so you've got that too, and then you put it together from there. So
when you decide, like this new Pink Floyd book about Dark Side of the Moon 50 years later, when you say, okay, day one, I'm in, and you start putting all those pages and you start analyzing the songs and working your process like you described. When you go through, we've all heard Dark Side of the Moon, right? We've all listened to it a billion times. Do you listen to it differently when you decide to write the book? Like, talk me through the process of analyzing an album that's one of the most famous albums that's ever been released, and an album that you probably know 100% by heart.
Yeah. Well, let me start with, I can never listen to it ever again, because it just it horrifies me. I played it again just before getting on with you here, right? And I'm listening to it, going, oh my God, this is depressing the heck out of me because it reminds me of work, right? Like Rush, I've written 6 Rush books. I can't listen to Rush ever again, right? So, and the funny thing about Dark Side of the Moon, I watched a video the other day. There's a bunch of young kids out there who do these kind of irreverent videos, and the guy kind of made a good point. It's like he called it just the most boring album he's ever heard, right?
Wow.
Like it's got a boringness to it. It's designed that way, right? I mean, it's really like, slow, and there's not much to the drumming and not much to the guitars and not much to the vocals. So that's the funny thing about Pink Floyd. They have that built-in intentional boredom to what they do, right? But the guy made a great point. He was going through and saying, I can't believe people think this is the greatest thing in the world. I'm so bored, right?
Because it's not high.
Yeah, right. And the other thing that Floyd does to try and make sure you're not too bored is they're putting in the sound effects and the little spoken word stuff. But to go back to an earlier point, to make something like this not daunting, I really had like where's my little thing here? I had a table of contents, whole book. Yeah. So the neat thing was going back and forth with Dennis about I want this many chapters on this, and I want this, and I want you to cover this, and I want 2 sidebars per chapter and all that. And then you start looking at a chronology and stuff. And it's funny, I was looking at the book and I don't, the table of contents isn't laid out the way I've got it here, but I've got chapter 1, the context as of 1972, sidebar 1, Syd Barrett. So all through I've got sidebars on each guy. Okay. So that's good. I've got live at Pompeii. I've got, the extra players. I've got side 1, side 2, recording side 1, recording side 2. So as soon as you have this great, this whole thing about eat the elephant one bite at a time, soon as you've got this massive structure laid out and all these trivia facts just start hitting you in the head, you start realizing I'm not dealing with that right now. All I'm dealing with right now is sidebar 2, which is a definition of progressive rock. That's all I'm talking about, right? And then what else we got here? The questions thing. So the thing when Roger asked people questions and to get the spoken word out of them. Or what else we got here? Tour date archive. So there's just an archive of tour dates. Sidebar 2 of chapter 6. So don't think about it. Just put it out of your head. Work through it in order. When you get to that, okay, time to build the tour date archive. Or I've got a sidebar on their new deal with Columbia. I've got a sidebar on the funny story of this album being on the Billboard 200, over and over again or continuously or whatever. Right. So that really helps. But so also to your point about listening to it, what I do with all of these books is I try not to listen all the way through stuff. All the way through. Like if you put the thing on at the beginning, when you're writing about the beginning song, you're playing these albums over and over and over again. By the time you got to write about the last song in the album, you've heard it 50 times, right? So you have to make sure that okay, if I'm not dealing with that song, I don't want to get so sick of it that I'm just going to be don't even want to work on it by playing it way too many times. So yeah, you just play the stuff in little chunks when you need to, so it's just not rolling through your head constantly.
And in perfect timing for the release of this book, which, by the way, comes out on Valentine's Day, just before the end of the year, Pink Floyd did a massive digital streaming dump that they've done the last couple years where they released 18 full live concerts from the Dark Side of the Moon era. Mm-hmm. Full shows now that people can go back and listen to the live performances in the era that you're talking about in the writing of this book.
Yeah, that's great too. But the main thing is this is called Pink Floyd Dark Side of the Moon 50 or something at 50. I don't know what it is, but the point is that it comes out on Valentine's Day. The album came out 50 years ago in March, so
right.
it's literally coming out. And Cordo's got a few of these planned. I've written another one as well.
But it shows that the interest on this album 50 years later, that the band is even releasing content from that era to help celebrate the anniversary. And if they can just dump 18 full live concerts, the Pink Floyd vaults must be insane.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, you just think about the Van Halen vaults. I mean, those vaults must be insane with Eddie sitting there working constantly, right, and just recording stuff and not putting it out. But yeah, it's pretty cool. I mean, this is a record that sold like 45 million copies. It's like 23 times platinum or something in the States, 15 times platinum, I guess, in the States. One of the top selling albums of all time. And obviously Pink Floyd were just a complete juggernaut. But before this is their 8th album. They were nobody before this, right? They're almost like the most extreme example that we can ever think of a band that was allowed to live on a major label by putting out just the most unlistenable music possible.
That's what
right?
I was going to bring up with you. Yeah. What happened with Pink Floyd, what you're talking about, would be unheard of today. That a band would be allowed to release 7 albums to be completely experimental with no hope of it being a massive commercial success. And then on the 8th album, it would be just like digging for oil, finding nothing, and them not pulling the plug on the drill. And then the 8th time around, they released Dark Side of the Moon. That mechanism with record companies and the way that the music industry functions today, that would never happen today.
Yeah, exactly. And they're still on a major label that whole time. And yeah, some of it was crazy, like Adam Hart Mother and Ummagumma and stuff like that. But, it's not like Dark Side of the Moon was like those records. I mean, it is way more commercial than anything they had done.
But they had to earn the right to get there. The label stuck with them, which is unbelievable. I mean, even looking at, you look at a career like Bon Jovi, right? Because in high school, like the sun rose and set on the hair of John Bon Jovi for me. But like Slippery When Wet or even Def Leppard with Hysteria, those are the records people think of. But they weren't their first records. The label stuck with them knowing that they would get there. Whereas now the way that it works is that if you don't have a number 1 song as the first single off the first record, good luck making it to the second or third record. So how many Dark Side of the Moons are we never going to get? Because the bands are never enriched enough to be able to release enough albums to get to that record that they were born to make.
Yeah. And it happened with quite a few bands. I mean, there are a whole bunch of bands that was making fairly commercial music, but so this is the other stream that weren't selling a lot of records, and they were allowed to live too, right? And the one I think of, because I'm working on something on King Crimson right now. King Crimson is as insane as Pink Floyd. That's a similar sort of situation where they're still on a major label and they're making the most insane music possible, and yet they're still allowed to live as well. But yeah, Floyd went so long that way, and it's not like there was nothing commercial along the way. I mean, the first 2 are perfectly good, serviceable psych albums, right? But then after that, it gets really weird. They got soundtrack albums, and metal's kind of getting there, sort of thing. But this was a big change, and then the debate is always like, what is this Dark Side of the Moon album? Is it progressive rock? I mean, that's a debate we have when we put together our dumb little YouTube shows all the time and stuff. Like, is Pink Floyd a progressive rock band? Right? They're kind of thrown into that, but they're not the first band that comes to mind. Everybody talks about Yes and Genesis and ELP and King Crimson and Jethro Tull and stuff first. But Pink Floyd, back to that. They're basically a 4/4 band, and it's very slow, and there's nobody's playing crazy virtuoso stuff all over the place. It's considered progressive really because of the conceptual nature and the album covers and stuff like that more than anything. And then I often say that the reason Pink Floyd made it, and I truly believe this, the reason Pink Floyd made it is the little doodads, the little ear candy, the little spoken word stuff. Like, that was genius. It had happened before. Beatles always do everything first. But Pink Floyd really made an art out of that. And I swear, I mean, with that music, which is not very inviting or showy, put it that way, there's really not a lot going on in the music. They really, I think, needed that to put it over the top. But it's just seems like a stupid little thrown off sort of thing to say, oh, Pink Floyd's famous because of what the heck is that guy saying in the background? Did we record some weird little conversation? It's so cryptic, right? That's it. I think that's why they made it.
It's also part of the legacy. Speaking of the Beatles, the new documentary, If These Walls Could Sing, about Abbey Road Studios, and just the unbelievable music and the legacy of that famous recording studio. You know, all of the albums that have been made there, including, you know, this documentary that Mary McCartney made. She was actually able to get Roger Waters and Gilmore both on this documentary, albeit obviously not in the same room at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Alan Parsons is big involved in Dark Side of the Moon, and he worked with the Beatles as well, right?
Yep.
So yeah, there's all that to it as well. And so this is one legacy of the Beatles, but I mean, even just the kind of simple music part of it. But I just find that so funny that, you know, so much of this is really, there's not a lot going on in this, but, you know, on this album as well, though, there's instrumental stuff. There's the guest vocal of Claire Torrey. There's sax. You know, Money is a strange song. You know, it's in a weird time signature and it's kind of funky. But again, you know, it's the cash registers and the fact that it's about money and things like that. You know, that make a hit single. Hit singles often come from. I did at least one, if not 2 or 3 episodes of my podcast on novelty, you know, novelty songs and whatever. And so many singles are hit singles simply because they got some stupid little novelty hook to them. And I swear with Pink Floyd and Money, it's those cash registers, right?
Do you know, in your vast research, where the Wizard of Oz tie-in with Dark Side of the Moon came from? Do you know who the person was that started this whole thing? Where did it come from?
Boy, I did a whole chapter on that. I did a sidebar on that called Dark Side of the Rainbow. And off the top of my head, I can't remember where it came from. I believe it just started off as like possibly just, boy, I'm not sure.
It was like
I had
viral
a blast
thing
watching
before
it
was viral.
Yeah,
like it became
so
this
cool
thing that people just kind of talked about. Did you ever try it? It's the roar of the lion, hit play on the record and sync it all up. And
then, you know, I right in that sidebar, it was a blast watching the same thing get done to Paul Blart Mall Cop, right? So there's a sync up with that, and you see amazing things happen. But when they do sync it up, that whole Dark Side of the Moon with Wizard of Oz makes it so creepy and occulty, right? Because you really learn the power of soundtrack music when it's applied to a movie. Because when certain things, it's not even necessarily the syncing up, but just certain music with certain things you're watching, there's a synergy there where 1 and 1 equal 3 kind of thing, where you go, wow, this is like some new art. It's doing something really strange to my brain, hearing this with that. And writing this King Crimson thing, it was pointed out in these interviews I'm doing. So there's one in Buffalo 66, Christina Ricci is dancing in an empty bowling alley to King Crimson Moonchild, which is amazing. And then there's what's that? There's a movie, a recent movie. What is it called? Children, Grown Men, something like that. But the whole opening sequence of this like spy film is set to King Crimson in the court, or King Crimson, the court of the Crimson King. It's not called in the, right? And you see this whole London city scene playing out, and you're getting this moldy, old Pink Floyd type song, and it's really powerful, right? So yeah, that's an incredible thing to watch. It's really cool watching that.
Well, watch a horror film with the volume down. Right, half the reason, I mean, Jaws is a perfect example. You never even really got to see the shark for like 3/4 of the movie, but the music is what made you afraid.
Yeah,
it's so necessary.
Yeah, and we've noticed like the power with Master of Puppets and the Kate Bush recently. We've noticed the power of taking, you know, a rock song and sticking it in there, rather than the thing we've grown up all our lives listening to is just classical music set to all this stuff, right? It's always classical and making funny little sound effects and things dropping and you know, all that. So when even still, the power of rock music when it's stuck on those films is incredible.
Last year, I had a chance to interview Nick Mason when he was going around with his Saucer Full of Secrets tour. I asked him if he had ever synced up Dark Side of the Moon with the Wizard of Oz. And he said he did, and then he got bored and he shut it off.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Well, part of that probably is to do with, again, listening to his own album makes him think about work, right? How many interviews, how many guys, rock stars have you interviewed that said, when we finished with that album, I've never heard it again. I don't even think I own a copy. And you see him looking around. I should get a copy of that album. I don't even own one anymore, right?
I ask artists with big catalogs sometimes if they could name all their album titles. If I started throwing out, can you give me the 7th song off of your 8th record? Like, would you know? Some artists can. Some artists, it's so ingrained in them that there was such a process and it's so personal for them that it's imprinted on them. And other artists are like, I have no freaking idea.
Yeah.
I would have to Google that
and
to
a
know.
Subtle thing, something that I've noticed, and I've even had this conversation with a few of them. I think Lemmy was one I was talking about this, but if we could get in their head for a minute, it's like, so they make the record for 2 or 3 or 4 weeks, right? Could be 30 years ago or whatever. But then you go on the road, their life, what they think their job is, these rock stars essentially, is playing live. They don't think of it as making records. And I'm constantly wanting to ask them about the records. And they're thinking, wait a minute. I mean, for 11 and a half months, all I do is play concerts. I'm like a performer. I'm a circus performer, right? But what Lemmy said kind of made a lot of point is like the songs off those records, the only ones I know, and I know them way better than I want to know them, are the ones I play live all the time. The rest of them, they're an ancient history. I don't know anything about those songs anymore.
Well, I talked to Will Turpin from Collective Soul just a few weeks ago, and he was like, when we're getting ready to go out on the road, we don't have to practice Shine. We know the song. We've played it 1,000 times. But if we're going to pull something out of the archive, then we do have to rehearse that, which is why looking at an artist like Bruce Springsteen, who's got such a massive catalog, and when you go see him live, his band has got to be able to keep up. If he just decides at the last minute, hey, I want to play this song that they didn't even rehearse, they got to know it and have it ready, and he's famous for doing that, whereas other artists could never pull that off because they don't have their catalog memorized to play live.
Yeah. Well, and they're also they're not, their bar is not as high as Bruce wants the bar to be for his guys, right? They're not that talented.
No,
right?
If you're in Bruce Springsteen's band, it's because you're the best that there is, because he's not easy on those guys. And they've all said so in interviews, like his bar is high, but his bar is high for himself as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Cool. So when you are analyzing music in the way that you do, whether it be researching for your podcast, which I want to talk about, when you're researching all of these books, which it still blows my mind. You've done it more than 115 times. What the hell do you do to get away from work? Because most people use music to get away from work. And for you and I and a lot of other people, we can't. So what is it that you do to rest your brain?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question, because I'm constantly having people say, "Oh, go play this. Oh, you'll like this," and stuff. And it's like, if I want to get in that conversation with them, I tell them I don't listen to music for leisure anymore. I have a lot of leisure, but it's usually, and that's the other thing about being a guy and growing old. There's this funny joke about guys and getting old. That's like basically, when I turned 50, I suddenly became really interested in World War II. And it's funny. And so the corollary of that is that I've found with myself and a lot of people I know is I've moved completely over from a fiction world into a nonfiction world. So I can't watch fiction movies anymore. It's only docs. I can't read fiction books anymore. It's only what is that? Nonfiction books, right? And I can't read music books. I don't, just nothing about music is really leisure anymore. To me, when I listen to music now, I'm always, the gears are going like, I got to make some notes of this. If I'm going to listen to something, it's because I'm going to write about it someday. And, I find myself listening to, that's the other thing. I don't listen to a lot of new music because I think I'm too old, that I'm never going to be writing about those new bands, nor do I care, nor can I even relate to them. But I find when I push back and people say, oh, what do we listen to? And I say, well, not much. But I tell them things like, I could see spending the next 2 months just learning about Susie and the Banshees, which I never paid attention to, and I love to death right now. Right. So there's so much. And then I thought, I've said this before, where they ought to have a word in the dictionary for nostalgia for things that you missed, but are from your era. Right. So I've told people, like, I could spend the rest of my life and probably another 100 years if I wanted to, just learning about things from the 70s and 80s that I didn't know about. And to me, that's better than new music. It just something about it, because you relate to it, and they were all made with big producers and expensive studios, and everything was handmade, and it was hard to do, and for all these crazy reasons. It's so to get back to your point, it's talk radio, talk YouTube, documentaries. I've worked with Banger Films too, so I've learned quite a bit about documentaries. So when I watch documentaries, it's kind of interesting to me to see how they're cooked, right? Not a lot of music, except jogging or in the car and stuff like that.
Well, it's like me getting in the car and trying to relax and listening to the radio, because I just can't not analyze it. It's not possible. Because it's what you do. So obviously you're going to listen to it, watch it, analyze it from a completely different. It's like being a welder and saying, hey, look at all these welds that someone else did. You can't not see the flaws. You can't not analyze the way that they did it. It just is what it is.
Yeah. Yeah.
You bring up the reference of Susie and the Banshees, and just as a side note, with Wednesday and the success of that series on Netflix, Jenna Ortega came out recently and said that the famous scene, I don't know if you've seen it, of this series of Wednesday is that she's at a school dance and she choreographed kind of this quirky, weird dance. And it's one of the most popular parts of the show so far. And she talks in interviews about how she went back and watched footage of Susie and the Banshees to help give her ideas for choreography. Cool. And so streams of Susie and the Banshees have gone up just because Jenna Ortega has been referencing Susie and the Banshees when talking about choreographing this dance scene in Wednesday. So it's so funny, like what you were talking about, that like, these older bands get used in these newer projects like Stranger Things, and then all of a sudden it all becomes new again. Master of Puppets included, Kate Bush included. Yeah,
for sure. Yeah, and just so much music out there. It's hard to keep out. It's basically art. I'm big into art as well too. I do art. I watch a lot of art stuff. I read art books and stuff. But the same thing's happening in all the arts, really. It almost seems like a little bit of like the fall of the Roman Empire thing, where you think, our problems are all like pretty ridiculous problems, right? Oh, we can't make, there's too many artists and too many musicians and all these things. Like there's not enough plumbers and drywallers and stuff, right? And you think it's everybody wants to be in the arts, right? But the fact of the matter is, the reason why it's hard to make money as a musician or hard to make money as the artist is it's just this massive fire hose of supply coming at you, when the demand is way smaller than that, right? And we still have all the old artists we can still listen to. So it just gets to be more and more and more and more. And then you got Spotify, it's just all right at your fingertips. So it's like, well, that's why every new band is going to have like 100 fans, right? There's going to be one artist for every 100 fans of everything, right?
Well, I mean, you definitely see it with a lot of the new artists. And I talk to a lot of them as, part of the podcast and stuff. And what's happening now is, especially in harder rock, especially with a lot of these newer, heavier bands, is that the outlets for them are starting to go away, meaning a lot of rock stations are going away. And so they're being driven back underground. And what's great about that is that the fans, it's all kind of going full circle, because now they're growing in this really organic way and developing these fan bases the old-fashioned way, which is the live shows, the shaking hands, the way that a lot of these rock bands broke back in the day is starting to happen again, because it's being forced that's how they have to break, because there aren't these big, massive, like you said, there's so much noise on the internet that in order for these bands to kind of break out of the noise and build a fan base, they have to do it by hitting the streets like the bands did back in the day.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it is working. Those bands are out there. Like, I spend a lot of my time kind of looking for these next generations of rock bands, and they are out there. It's just they're mixing the ingredients, right? The ingredients don't really change. There's only so many spices. There's only so many ingredients. If you're going to make a cake, flour's got to be in there. But it's the mixtures of them and the inspirations. And these newer bands are taking inspiration from a lot of different places, especially hip hop, because they're growing up with that being omnipresent. Whereas, you know, growing up in the 60s and 70s, it didn't exist.
Yeah.
So they're definitely there, but it's a different thing. And these major labels aren't signing a lot of bands that they know, to go back to what we were talking about, will be a success automatically. So there's this really cool underbelly of these indie labels and bands that are breaking without a record company. That it's a very weird time in the quote music business right now.
Yeah.
It's exciting but weird.
Yeah, it would just make me despondent, you know, when I think about, I don't know what the number is, but I think it's over 100,000 albums out every year, right?
Yeah.
You know, and people have said it in the thing we're doing in podcasting and YouTube shows, right? They say if your numbers aren't going down, you're doing great, because there's so many new podcasts and YouTube shows being added all the time because it's so easy to do and the technology gets easier and easier. So, you know, apparently, like, if we're not even growing our numbers very much and we're even maintaining, that's a victory, because there's just so much more competition all the time, right?
Well, I'll correct you and say this. It's easy to start. Starting a podcast, starting a video show, starting all of those things is easy to start. Mm-hmm. It is not easy to maintain. And that's something that you see a lot with people that get into podcasting is, you know, the gateway to it, the gear, the equipment. That's, you know, back in the day in the 70s, you needed a big $1 million studio and the engineers and all of that. Now you got a computer and you get a little microphone or whatever, and but get 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. What are you up to? Like 190 podcast episodes now? Like,
yeah, 182, I think.
Yeah, like getting up to that point is hard, because you got to be able to feed the beast, as I say. You've got to be able to find new things to talk about, and that's why a lot of people start podcasting or start YouTubing and then they quit.
Yeah.
Because they run out of ideas.
Pod fade, as Christian calls it, right?
Yes, it is pod fade. So talk to me about the concept behind your podcast, because obviously, you know, when you decide to start a podcast, like the Mistress Carrie podcast is a rock lifestyle podcast, I call it. So I can talk to an author like you. I can talk to musicians. I talk to techs, people that work behind the scenes, sound engineers, roadies, and then anyone that's kind of involved in the music lifestyle. So whether it be Metallica's master brewer of their, or master distiller of their whiskey, or people that are in the lifestyle, when you're going to give birth to a new podcast, you have to have an idea. Your idea, I think, is really cool and inventive, and something only someone like you that has such a vast musical knowledge could feed that beast. So for someone that's never heard your podcast, can you talk to me a little bit about it? And where you came up with the idea?
Yeah, the funny thing is, literally when Christian contacted me and said, you got an idea for podcast, and we'd like you to do a podcast for us. It took me 5 minutes to come up with that idea. It was literally the first thing I came up with. But, you know, having done a bunch of YouTube shows and stuff and gone on people's shows, I suppose it's that whole thing, like, you know, how long did it take you to do that painting? It looks like my kid could have done it. And you say, well, it took me 35 years. That's why I could do it so fast. And that's why I can do it, period. Right. So maybe there's a bit of that in there, so the concept is It's called History in 5 Songs with Martin Popoff. And part of that is tribute to Marco Barbieri, who named his heavy metal label Century Media Records because he didn't want it to have just a heavy metal name, right? He just wanted it to sound just general, right? So that just subconsciously went through my mind as well. So I wanted a name. It's not even a great name, but I wanted a name that that didn't pin me to heavy metal because I didn't want to get pinned to heavy metal, number one. So the main part of the concept is I just I come up with an idea, a theme, and there's 5 30-second clips that feed into that theme, and then hopefully I got categories that those 5 fit into, and hopefully I've got a few examples also that fit into that category, and then at the end I'll say some honorable mentions or whatever. But so that's kind of it, and so it's not heavy metal. It's a pretty general thing. It's a framework. The other thing I wanted to do that I told myself very quickly, subconsciously, was I didn't want to have anybody on ever. I just never wanted to interview anybody. I don't want to think about guests. I don't want to schedule every single time I want to do one of these. When the idea hits me, I want to just be able to do it, right? Make a few notes and just go. I do know there's no editing at all. So there's no stopping, starting. It's just all the way right through. Because I'm kind of low tech, Pantheon strips in my music clips, but that's all. So they do that, and they do all the stuff with ads. I don't even think about any of that. So I just speak it out in a rapid fire, 26 to 32 minutes. Every single one is like that. I keep an eye on the clock and make sure it's a half hour every time. Christian always jokes with me that, Martin's got this format and he says exactly the same thing every time. It's like, I'd say, Christian, once, long time ago, before I did the first one, I said, tell me exactly what to say to introduce. And he did, and I typed it out. And so it's sitting there. And every time I save my new episode, it's there. So it's like, Christian, that's why I say exactly the same thing every time. You told me this off the top of your head 180 episodes ago. And that's why I say the exact same thing every time, right? So the main thing I definitely wanted to do is I didn't want to have to think about guests, wonder how good they're going to be, how long they're going to talk, are they going to go off topic, blah, blah, blah. Because I interview guys all the time, and there's always that stress and nervousness, and they stand you up, and then you got to do it again, or you got to do it at their time. And so that's what I wanted to do as well, just make it a no guest show, which gets me out of people saying, can I be on your podcast? And I say, no, I don't have any guests. So that's good too. But yeah, so it leans hard rock and heavy metal. Out of those 180 episodes, I'm sure 130 of them are definitely hard rock and heavy metal of some sort. But yeah, just come up with 5 examples of something that fits a theme. I've done best album titles and best and worst album titles recently. A million different things, but essentially that's it. 5 little 30-second music clips, and now there's this debate, Christian's talking about it, the thing, we're pretty soon we're going to be allowed to use full songs. And I wrote him back and said, I don't know if I want to do that. I don't know if I want to be a radio station. I don't know if I want this thing to just go on and on and on. So, maybe it'll stay at 30 seconds, what I stick in there. Right.
See, and so the reason why I wanted to ask you that question is that our podcasts are literally a photo opposite negative of each other, right? Is that I want the interviews, I want them to go off topic, and I want the songs, because the thing about doing the interviews on the air live in radio is, I call it kind of sitting there with your ass hanging out. Like, you're live, you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know what kind of crazy thing could happen, but I also want to be able to reference it back to the songs. I look forward to the time that I can put music into my podcast and put the full songs in there so that I can say, hey, this is your brand new song. We got to play it. And then I want to come back and talk about it, analyze it. I make a corresponding playlist for every episode of the podcast with all of the music that I put together, including I'm going to put one about your episode and go back and find songs from all of the artists that we referenced, so that anyone that's finding out who you are for the first time, you may have mentioned King Crimson and they've never heard of them before. They know they can go into the corresponding playlist and find some King Crimson songs, and maybe it's going to turn them on to something they've never heard before.
Yeah, but don't you worry? Like, I would think 90% of the people don't want to hear the full song of what you're going to play. They're going to go, oh my God, she's going to play a 4 minute and 30. Kids these days are just, and me even, I'm so guilty of it on Spotify. When I'm checking out an album now, I swear to God, I'm like clicking on 4 or 5 second samples of those songs and then going to the next one. Like I'm literally down to 4 or 5ve seconds for me to sort out what this album is.
It's
what it
literally
sounds like, right?
speed dating on your app. Like it's Tinder.
But you got to realize, so on my podcast, for example, if like my latest episode was called Sounds Like Cashmere, right? So literally, I don't think I included actual cashmere in my 5 examples. So I have 5 examples, right? But a couple of those only have a part that sounds like cashmere. There's Genesis Squonk on there. But, say, for example, I was going to play, say one of my examples of some stupid episode was Sweet Home Alabama, right? I don't think anybody wants to hear the entire song when I talk about it, right? I mean, they don't even want to hear the clip probably, but if I used it formally and I'll actually, if I have 5 examples in a category for my first song, that fits something, right? Say, I did an episode on cool fade outs. Fade outs of songs and what's going on in the fade out or whatever. But I'll make sure actually I play a song that's not so normal that everybody knows, because I'm thinking they don't even want to hear 30 seconds of Led Zeppelin Black Dog, right? So I'll pick a different song even just to bore them for the 30 seconds. But everybody knows they're only getting 30 seconds. So I think they're going to stick around. They're not going to turn off, because I swear if we turn into radio stations and start turning in 2 and 3 hour shows, they're not going to want to be there, because they don't want to be forced to listen to whole songs. I don't think.
I think it depends on where you're listening, right? Yeah. As someone that still works in radio, I think it depends. You go back to those people that are plumbers and framers and long haul truck drivers. They're not sitting at a computer flicking through Spotify 5 seconds at a time. They're actually doing their job, and the music is what's keeping them company. Is I'm kind of that devil that sits on their shoulder throughout the day that talks to them and plays the music and kind of talks about what's going on or whatever. But a lot of time it's harder for them to kind of flip quickly because their hands are full of tools and they're doing things as opposed to,
do you know for sure? I mean, maybe most of those plumbers would actually rather hear you talking way more often and way less music, or they don't want to hear you talking at all and they only want to hear music. So we don't know, right?
That's the delicate balance of radio, of podcasting, of all of that is, I think it depends on what you're talking about and whether or not they're interested in it. I think, like to go back to the whole World War II thing, if somebody's into World War II, I could talk for 5 hours on the radio about it and they'd be interested, whereas someone else would be like, what the hell? I just want you to play Black Dog. I'm over here welding. Keep me company. And that's the trial and error of it, is that, what's that old saying? You can keep some of the people happy some of the time, but you can't keep all the people happy all the time. Like,
right. Yeah.
It just is. But I think it is an exciting thing that the ability to use a full song in a podcast, whether or not you do it, the ability to be able to do it, that the music industry is evolving to the point where the music licensing and all of those things can be paid for, where podcasters could find a way to use the songs, I think is an exciting thing if that's what you want to do.
Oh, yeah. And so many times, in this, because we're limited 30 seconds, so many times I wanted that extra 10 seconds or more because I had 2 or 3 points I wanted to make, and it takes 45 seconds to make that point, right? And then other times when you're thinking, I would love to turn people onto this song, to this music, and I think it needs the whole song to turn them on. Then your brain's going, okay, I'm actually now thinking like a DJ, right? Because in my podcast, I'm not particularly the aim isn't all the time to be turning people on to music. It's to be telling people stupid factoids about this stuff, right? So that's two totally different roles. But that DJ role is why I like writing the books too. It's like, I want to turn people onto this, so I'm going to describe it in an exciting way, and I'm going to give you cool quotes from the artist about it because I really want you to be a Rainbow fan, right? So that's pure DJ, right? Me writing a book on a band is me being a DJ, but my podcast's more like, let's just find all the haha funny versions of bands making songs that sound like Kashmir.
Well, I cannot wait to kind of dig through this Dark Side of the Moon book, because I think when you look at greatest album of all time, right? And I don't mean subjective and you know, the debate over art and all of that. I just mean bare bones stats. It is one of the biggest albums that's ever been released. An album that will live on forever for whatever reason it is. The artistry, the imagery, the sound effects, whatever it is, it's just something that will just always be. And so to be able to kind of go through it, analyze the little factoids, to kind of dig through it, and to be able to look at it with the rear view mirror looking back 50 years, which I cannot believe, I think is pretty cool. So it comes out on Valentine's Day, and
it's literally a really good pile of liner notes is what it is, right? And that's why I used to love immersion boxes, to even use a Pink Floyd term. I mean, those, you know, I've got my Dark Side immersions. That's for me. I don't buy a lot of physical product anymore, but when I do, my favorite thing is box sets, and my favorite thing is liner notes. Can I just ask you one quick question?
Sure.
What are your 5 favorite albums of all time?
5 that's really hard. And as someone that's asked that question a million times, it's very dependent on like the time, right? Like the Beatles is going to be in there at least once, but the album is going to change. Sometimes I'm going to say the White Album. Sometimes I'm going to say Sgt. Pepper. Sometimes I'm going to say Abbey Road. Sometimes when I'm feeling a little frisky, it's Rubber Soul. But the Beatles, like, there's no way, being the Beatles lover that I am, that a top 5 album thing for me. I'm one of those people, and it's something I got from my mom, that certain albums are frozen in time for me, right? So in my high school years, I think some of the biggest records for me were Slippery When Wet from Bon Jovi, because it is the soundtrack to so many amazing times in my life, that the music, the artistry, all of that is inconsequential. It's what that album has as far as emotional connection to me. You know, the same thing with like a Queensryche Operation Mindcrime. I love that album, and I will still go and just listen to it top to bottom. There's going to be probably the Downward Spiral from 9 Inch Nails in there, because that's the soundtrack to my college. And I think that album is just an absolute masterpiece. And being a diehard 9 Inch Nails fan like I am, I just love that record. Probably Tool Anima is going in there, talking about, you know, being one of those people that listens to a 7, 8, 9 minute song and not skipping through Spotify the way that you're talking about. There's a lot of that kind of stuff in there. I'd probably want to put a Metallica album on there, but one day it's going to be Injustice for All. The next day it's going to be Master of Puppets. I'll get into the fight about putting the Black Album on there, because I don't care what anybody says. That album is a masterpiece, whether you want to critique Metallica for having some commercial success with it or not. You know, there's an album like Appetite for Destruction that, how many times can you listen to Sweet Child of Mine? But you can't argue that that album is an absolute gem and came out in those formative music years for me.
Yeah.
Like it, I don't know. So that's why when I interview artists, the way that I ask that question is, and I'll ask you the same question, even though you're only a hobby drummer, as you said. I ask artists to give me an example of a song they think is so well crafted that they covet it and wish they wrote it. Give me an example of perfect songwriting, and then break it down and tell me why. So I'll ask you that question.
Yeah, I've been known in the back of one or two books, greatest songs of all time. I put Aerosmith "Draw the Line" in there before because to me it relates to Led Zeppelin Celebration Day in that it's like the most sophisticated, cool, interesting, a riff with a lot of notes in it that goes over a bunch of time, rock and rolls as well. I've been known to call that song an epic, but they didn't need to make it epic length to make it like an epic. It's got the most extreme Steven Tyler vocal performance. It does sound like an amazing Rolling Stones song, but also an amazing heavy metal song. That whole, when he's singing the verses, it sounds like the most heroic Keith Richards going, but then it goes into that other dun, 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 dee, dee, and that little dee, dee, that reminds me of Celebration Day. That's where it comes from, Celebration Day. So I've often said my favorite Zeppelin songs are Friends, Celebration Day, and In My Time of Dying. And Celebration Day is such a weird one to pick, but I listen to it, so those two things line up to me. Like that's the most sophisticated riff Jimmy Page ever did. And I think Draw the Line is the most sophisticated thing. But an even more perfect Aerosmith song is Walk This Way. In fact, I did a podcast episode. That's right. So I did one. What did I call it? It was literally, the idea was these are songs that are so good that my favorite thing would be sitting in the boardroom and walking in as the band and putting that song on for the staffers, and they're all sitting around a big table and they're just losing their minds at the money they're going to make off of this song. And in that, I included Walk This Way, Bohemian Rhapsody,
which just hit 2 billion streams on Spotify.
Yeah, Bohemian Rhapsody is the most extreme, amazing song ever done, on a really objective level. But I included Pantera, Cowboys from Hell, and Madness, Our House.
Wow.
So these are all ones where I could just picture the staffers like looking, and then I made a joke in there about how Alice Cooper School's Out, right? And I remember saying in the podcast, I said, and I could picture one guy looking to the guy next to him and said, how come you never bring me any songs about the last day of school? That kind of thing, right? So like, there's just these genius ideas that happen in songs, right? Where you go, that was a great idea. That was going to be a hit, just because the stupid idea, right? So that's a funny thing when you think of, and that goes back to episodes I've done on novelty and stuff as well. But, because in that you've got the kids singing and the No More Pencils, No More Books, and you've got the bell going off and all that stuff all helps, right? You think of Ballroom Blitz by Sweet. There's just so many. There's songs with a bunch of bells and whistles in it. And nothing has more bells and whistles in it than Bohemian Rhapsody.
Yeah, seriously.
But yeah, I think my, the first one that came to mind for me, that Aerosmith song is like not incredibly intuitive like a Bohemian Rhapsody, but I think, man, that is really perfectly done.
Well, most of the time when I ask artists that songwriting question, more often than not, it's a song that is brilliant in its simplicity. And it's a theme that comes up over and over again with songwriters that I talk to, is that amazing songwriting isn't necessarily complex songwriting. It's that the brilliance of it is in its simplicity. And
I think they're wrong, though, because when you ask for the best song out of millions and millions and millions of songs, it's probably got to have a lot of everything. And simple songs are just too subjective. And, it's just, it's like abstract painting, right? My kid could do that. If you get simpler and simpler and simpler, like I ain't going to pick an Eagles song for greatest song of all time, right? I think it's got to have some fireworks to it to be amazing, to not argue about it. Put it that way. Yeah. Like a Bohemian Rhapsody, you're not really going to argue about that one. You know what I mean?
Well, they did when it came out. They didn't even want to
argue about She Loves You, and I want to hold your hand, right? It's like everybody can sit around and go, yeah, boy, yeah, that's a beautifully written song. It's just so well put together. And then some other guys say, well, that's stupid. It's, and they're both right, right? So
I interviewed Mark LaBelle from Dirty Honey, and he told me about a conversation that he had with Brian Johnson from AC/DC. And there was a 3-week gap between when AC/DC went out on the road and when Back in Black came out. Mm-hmm. And in those 3 weeks, the band was on tour. And he talked about how Brian Johnson was telling Mark LaBelle what it was like to be the new singer of AC/DC in front of these crowds that hadn't heard the album yet. And that Malcolm would go up to him and be like, come on, let's really blow their minds. Let's hit him with Back in Black. Imagine being one of those people in one of those crowds that heard Back in Black live before you got to hear the record.
Yeah.
And it goes back to what you're talking about walking into that boardroom and dropping the record off. It's like, imagine having your first exposure of Back in Black be at an AC/DC concert when no one knew what the record was going to sound like without Bon Scott.
Yeah.
And then it's
funny you mentioned that one. I think that's the only song off that album that could do that in that boardroom at all. Because I don't think You Shook Me All Night Long or Hell's Bells is really going to have the same effect. Back in Black almost gets there, but AC/DC just as a rule has that built-in simplicity and boredom thing that's not going to drive them absolutely bonkers on a subjective level, right?
Yeah.
I mean, on an objective level. On a subjective level, any song on that album might go, oh my God, it's going to be so huge. But Back in Black, it's just got the spaces in it and the simplicity and the different parts all put together. It's not that simple a song, right? It's when you break it down, they do a bunch of cool things in it, right? So,
well, I'm going to butcher the quote, but there's a story about Angus being on a radio show back in the day, and someone called and was like, AC/DC sucks. They've made the same album 12 times. And Angus just leaned forward and said 13.
Oh, yeah.
And it's like, but the brilliance of it is that who's got a deeper catalog of songs that are omnipresent? Like the number of songs that are constantly getting used in commercials, movies, that are just on the radio all the time, that you're just always surrounded by, and it's AC/DC. They're just everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, definitely one of my favorite bands of all time.
Yeah, me too. Yeah. Well, it was so cool hanging out with you. Thank you so much for talking to me. And
thank you. This was fun.
The new book comes out Valentine's Day, Pink Floyd and Dark Side of the Moon, 50 years. A deep dive, a lot of interesting stuff. I'm so glad you tackled the Wizard of Oz thing in there, because it was a viral thing before viral was viral. And, the legacy lives on is just one of the many things that make this album so special. So it was so cool to see you. Happy New Year.
Yes, absolutely. You too. Yeah.
Thank you for being my first guest of 2023.
Excellent.
And
Very cool.
I'm sure I'll be running into eventually, maybe all of the Pantheon podcasters will get together in person someday, as opposed to just on those big, massive Zoom calls that we do every once in a while.
Yeah, there was a thread of that a while ago. Something about someplace in Montana, even, actually, for some reason. But then there's always, Rock and Pod and those kinds of things, podcasts. So we'll make some trips for some of those.
Yeah, we'll have a beer someday for sure.
Yeah. Cool. All right. Thanks again.
No problem. It was good to see you. Thanks again. We'll talk to you soon.
See you later.
There he is, author and podcast host, the one and only Martin Popoff. His new book is called Pink Floyd and the Dark Side of the Moon, 50 Years, and it's coming out on February 14th. You can get more details on Martin and all of his books. Just check the links in the show notes of this episode. You'll also find all of my links as well, and the link to this episode's corresponding playlist. I make a playlist for every full-length episode of the Mistress Carrie podcast that features all of the music that gets referenced in the interview. If you liked what you heard, don't forget to like and follow the Mistress Carrie podcast. New full-length episodes come out every Wednesday, plus every weekday you get the sit rep. The Situation Report is all of your rock news, music headlines, and entertainment info in just 5 minutes. Plus, you never know when we're going to release a bonus episode. You can join me every Tuesday night live on my official Facebook page for my video show, Cocktails in the War Room. And you can always find me on the radio on the Mistress Carrie Radio Show. Get details on all of that and check out my concert calendar, blog, official online Mistress Carrie store, and so much more at mistresscarrie.com. The Mistress Carrie Podcast, a proud member of the Pantheon Podcast Network.